Our next speaker is Keller. We've been talking about the soul. He's going to talk about the existence and nature of the human soul. Chick is well known here in Los Alamos. He needs no introduction here, but for those of you who are from out of town, he says he was born at an early age. 12 years of Catholic school education in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania area. He entered a seminary in 1957, graduated cum laude, magna cum laude in philosophy, but then he left the seminary. And 3 years later at Penn State, he got a BS in physics and math, and then he spent 5 years at Indiana U and got a PhD in astronomy and astrophysics. Then he came here. Spent 33 years at the laboratory, computer modeling of flows, atmospheres, had some work with underground tests. He was a group leader from 75 to 87. And then he became the director of the Atlanta branch of the University of California's Institute of Geophysics and Planetary Physics. And got his sabbatical at Scripps, studying climate change. And he's one of the local experts here on climate change. He's written several review papers on this subject of human causes of climate change. He retired in 2001, but he continues to read and write. He's the chairman of the Christian Concern Committee at the church, IHM, and he's one of the co-founders of the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum. And like I say, he's quite a local expert on climate change. And one of the things is, if we had more time, we would have a tour of the Pajarito Educational Environment Center. It's called Peak here. It's a beautiful building, and Chick was one of the people that led the effort to get that thing built, and it's a centerpiece of this town. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that. But Chick, thank you.
First, a piece of logistics. I left 2 books sitting out there. One was this book, and one was by Nancy Murphy. And that other book is gone. Does anybody have that book, or did it just... Oh, okay. Just so I know where it is. Let's see. How do I advance slides? You just push the arrow?
Yeah, push an arrow. There you go.
Okay, I want to do the following thing. And I'll go back here so you won't read that. Most of the talks today have not had much science in them. Let's be honest. I want to give a talk that has almost all science. Now, we all agree that science can't tell you what is. It can only approximate what is. But what science can do for the philosopher is tell you what isn't. If the idea that you're thinking of is a big tabletop, you can go anywhere on that tabletop with your ideas. Once several scientific experiments have been made, you can't go to this part of the table anymore. That's out of balance. We can say that for sure. You can still do it because science doesn't know what the answer is, but you can't go here anymore. Now, the talk I'm going to give is scientific studies that at least call into question whether you can go there anymore. And whether or not that's convincing to you, I'd like people at least to have those kinds of things in their heads when they're thinking about the human soul. Most people in cultures have an abiding sense that there's something really remarkable about us, connected but distinct from our bodies. Body-soul dualism has played an important part and a positive role in Christian ethics. I might say, to give names, that Stephen is a dualist from that point of view. Many say that the spiritual soul is clearly what distinguishes us from other things. So there we start. Here's a wonderful thing there. I have lots of pictures like that, but there's not enough time to go into all this. But the whole idea that when you die, the soul leaves your body. What does Scripture say? Well, Paul points out unquestionably the uniqueness of humanity, but it does not say that that singularity is the possession of a soul. It's the human vocation given and enabled by God to relate to God as God's partner in covenant, companionship with the human family. Pierre de Chardin, interesting speculations, spirituality. Chardin essentially said, look, I have this cartoon that the old guy with the big white beard and the robe, and he's standing on a cloud, and there's some angels standing beside him, and you can see the whole universe. And the guy is looking at him and saying, "You did it all with quarks? Get out of here." Well, Chardin essentially said, what we're talking about is quarks. And what we're going to do is organize them. If we organize them this way, we'll get this. If we organize this, we'll get more. And the more we organize all those things, the more complex the thing gets, until we get to a being that can understand the transcendent, that can understand God, right? So the question about spirituality is, did the Creator, it's worth thinking about, put the ability for spiritual to come out of organization of material? When you think of matter, anyway, when you really look at matter, you don't find matter, you find interactions. And so it's at least worth keeping in mind, and that was the kind of thing Chardin said. Recent considerations. This is Nancy Murphy's book, which the lady has now, Whatever Happened to the Human Soul, and she has a whole lot of different people writing chapters on different aspects of their science or their philosophy in dealing with the human soul. And she comes up with this non-reductive physicalism, their final conclusion. Physicalism is the non-spiritual part, but the word non-reductive allows for something extra, because she says, well, you know, when we look at it all, we just get physicalism. But we all have a feeling that there's something more. So non-reductive physicalism allows us to continue thinking about this. We're going to only go for two questions. What's the function of the soul? And when do you get the soul? And by answering those two questions, we will then have some boundary conditions, or at least some considerations that we have to keep in mind when we try to decide about the soul. Here are the posited functions of the soul. And for instance, Stephen would say free will, right, recognition, these kind of things of consciousness are, you have to have a soul to have that, you see. Life, I think we can dispense with life. We have ancestors that just barely preceded us, Neanderthals and those kinds of things. They were almost like us. They were making things, they were doing things, and they were alive. So you don't need the soul to be alive. But the higher functions are very important. And finally, the existence after death. I would have loved to be when Lazarus came out of the tomb. He was there for several days. I would have loved to say, what was it like? Evolution seems to say no to our ancestors. Well, we just talked about that. Consciousness. Neuroscience studies are showing how the material brain produces and uses consciousness. This book, if you're interested in anything like this, is required reading. Because this gentleman and his colleagues don't want to make any assumptions at all. They're very much like René Descartes. They just want to sit down and look at the brain and ask, what does the brain do? And they start with unconsciousness, and they look at how the brain works when you're asleep, when you're in a coma, well, all these different things. And they can see all kinds of signatures, and there's some very sophisticated methods now to interrogate places in the brain. Most neuroscience just tells you, well, that's at this place and that's at this place. This one says, we watch it happen. And they do the most interesting experiments to show what the brain can sense and what it can't sense, what it does in the unconscious. And when they're done with the unconscious, then they look and see what the brain does when it's conscious that's different. And these are just scribbles on the line. These are just this and that. But it's a wall of evidence. And what it essentially says is the brain is fully capable of conscious action. The unconscious, there's a million things. When you're sitting looking at one of us, the brain knows the whole thing around, but it discards that. You know, there's all kinds of information that the brain throws away because it knows it's not the stuff. And then what they find is it sends a few things up to this workplace where all of a sudden the whole brain is interacting like crazy. And when that happens, you make a decision on that. We're going to come back to that. When not conscious, You can read this. When you're awake and alert, you have lots of fast activity. The interconnectivity is higher brain power. And he admits we've really just barely scratched the surface, but what we find is already telling us a whole lot. There are some of the things, and I don't want to go into any more, but when you read the book, you're going to be confronted with lots of these diagrams that show you what's going on and what's not. Simply simulating parts of the brain's neurosciences can make people feel sad. They can just poke you, and all of a sudden you're sad. They can poke you and you say, oh, my arm moved. They can even give you an out-of-body experience by poking you in just the right place. All these kinds of subjective things they can do just by stimulating part of your brain. And brain tumors, remember the Texas guy who got up in the tower and shot 70 people or something like that, having already killed his wife? He had been complaining for about a month before that he had these terrible inclinations and he didn't know what to do about them and everything else, and then he did all that. The autopsy of his brain showed he had a great big tumor that was pushing on part of his brain. And the next study, and this is written, and you can get the Life magazine's thing on the brain, how the brain functions. It's just out and you can read this. There was a guy who was a really nice guy, everything was fine. And all of a sudden he got this uncontrollable urge for being a pedophile. And he fought against it and did all kinds of things. And they discovered he had a brain tumor, and they went and took the brain tumor out. And he was fine. He never had those inclinations again. A year later, he started to go back. They looked and said, oh, we missed this little piece. And they took that out, and he's fine again. So what we're finding out is the brain is doing a lot of things, and in this particular case, taking away your free will. Brain scans can predict with startling accuracy the likelihood that criminals will run afoul of the law. Scientists have declared this in proceedings of the National Academy of Science. What about when brains don't work? You know, what is your soul going to do when brains don't work? You can do all kinds of things to the brain, and they've seen all these different studies where a piece of the brain isn't working anymore, and whether you have a soul or not, boy, it doesn't work. Now, this idea of an interface, you can say, well, the interface was messed up, and I won't go there, but I can say that what we're finding out is almost everything that happens to us happens in terms of what the brain is doing. Now, take a butterfly. A butterfly, how big is the butterfly's brain? How many cells? Not many. And yet it can mate, it can find things, it can avoid it, you can do all kinds of things. And that little tiny thing. We have these billions of neurons and axons, and they're different sizes, and they're all kinds of things. Just billions of them. What makes you think that the brain can't do that? In other words, matter has organized itself finally high enough that we can recognize and do things that have other beings haven't done. Free will, a lot of study. Apparently most human activity is not a result of free decision. Most of the things we do are just sort of reaction and this and that. But there are times, and you've made a really good point, where you actually consider everything and you make a decision, right? The Haines study shows that the brain's function is that it is free. Tumors can mess you up, so you can't do that, but bottom line, important decisions seem to be freely made. But does this require a soul? When you look at what is going on, you come up with the conclusion that the concept of free will to a neuroscientist doesn't even make sense. That's a philosophical concept, whether you have free will or not. And people are running around trying to make sure that we're not automatons. What DeHane's findings are, we're not automatons. Our unconscious and conscious conspire to let us look at our past history, our inclinations, what people have just told us, our religion, all these different things, and the workspace in consciousness puts that all together and makes a decision. That's what the brain does. The brain makes decisions, and they are free. Now, they've been able to make computer programs using putting in the kind of things that they're seeing with their studies, and they get a computer program that reproduces an awful lot of what they observe the brain doing. And so DeHane comes to the conclusion, and this is something you need to think about, it's very likely we can write a computer program that has free will. One in which you take all the information you need, you put it together, and you weigh it and come up with a decision. Now, if free will is more than that, I don't know what we're talking about anymore. But are you predetermined to do that? It's quite clear from their studies that you're not. You really make the decision. And so for these people, the idea of free will is, sure, that's what the brain does, no problem. What about origins of morality? People would say, well, you need a soul to be able to study what's good and bad. You see, Adam and Eve ate from the tree of good and evil, right? Well, here we are, 34,000 years ago, and there's somebody buried with several thousand little beads covering them. They're quite clearly somebody thought that they were going to have some valuable afterlife. In addition to ceremonial burials, there seem to have developed about 50,000 years ago norms needed for group activity. Hard work, cooperation, sharing, no stealing. But it's more innate than this, as seen by other animals, which sort of do the same thing. Animals have, especially herd animals and group animals, have rules about how you have to act if you're with the group. And they get ostracized or punished if they don't do what they're supposed to do. Now that's primitive compared to us, but nevertheless it's still there. Morality in chimpanzees, other chimps. But here's the one that's really interesting. This is Kanzi. And you see what Kanzi's doing? What is he doing? He's eating breakfast. He took a pack of matches. After he put the sticks together, he lit a fire, he cooked his breakfast, and he's eating it. Okay? He's a bonobo. And real quick, this story is one that really makes you think. One of the bureaucrats came to see this operation where this man and woman were running these bonobos and that. And he didn't like some things that were going on. And he was talking in another room with this lady. And he began shouting at her and pounding the table. Kanzi came up to this handler, and they communicate rather well by lots of different things, and let him know that Kanzi wanted this handler to go in and punish that man. And the guy let it be known, no, I'm not going to do that. And Kanzi told him, if you don't do that, I'm going to bite you. 3 days later, Kanzi ran into the room, bit him in the hand so bad he had to have 3 operations to put it back together again. The man wouldn't have anything to do with Kanzi after that. And he let the woman communicate with Kanzi that until you ask forgiveness, I'm not having anything to do with you. 1 month later, Kanzi came in and essentially asked for forgiveness. So we have moral outrage, we have action on the spur of the moment of things you shouldn't do, knowing it was wrong and asking forgiveness. Wow. Sin and repentance for Kanzi, there they are. Aesthetics. People say, well, we love beautiful things, it's just so great, and it's a part of us that we don't need for our evolution, we don't need to survive, we just have aesthetics. The ability to abstract, art, mathematics, are amazing in response. So what about this? There's a chimpanzee named Congo, and he paints. He's made hundreds of paintings, and some of them sold for a lot of money. And here's what they look like. But those are pretty interesting paintings for a chimpanzee, don't you think? They're not just scribblings. He's sort of doing something. He's sort of got an idea of how he wants color and shape to interact. So do chimpanzees have aesthetics? 250,000 years ago, we start to see these kinds of markings on rocks, which means we have a being which thinks it's important to represent something they're thinking about on a rock 250,000 years ago. Here's 50,000 years ago, the first flute, so music goes back that far. And there's the cave at Chauvet, in which Picasso said when he looked at these things, he said, we haven't learned anything since. These people were incredible artists way back there, and they thought it was important to do it. This must have been a lot of work in the dark. Spirit-to-spirit communication. One idea is that we need a spiritual side to interact with spiritual beings. But this point turned around is cautionary. In history, spiritual beings mostly had to take on material bodies or interact in a material sense, like hearing a voice. before the spiritual was able to be communicated to the material. Now, Pentecost, to me, I was thinking about that, might be an exception, because it all comes down, nobody's talking, and all of a sudden these guys are inspired to do things that they never would have done before. So I'm not ruling that out. I'm just saying the idea that you need a soul for this kind of communication may or may not be as strong as you'd like it to be. Biblical accounts of the afterlife, I think, are very interesting. I mean, he has Lazarus and the rich man parable, Moses and Elijah transfiguration. David rejoiced to see my time. I'm the God of the living, not the dead. You will not abandon my soul to the netherworld. Now, so when you look at those things, you say, well, you know, it sounds like there's life after death, doesn't it? Now, you could say that, as Polkinghorne says, God knows all about you. So when you die, you're gone. But he can put you back together in an instant. He knows everything about you to do it. So if you want to do the transfiguration, you can call up Moses and Isaiah just like that. And so it's something to think about. But there's an awful lot of discussion about whether when you die, it's all over until the last day and you rise, or whether when you die, something knowledgeable of you goes up to heaven and looks down and interacts in some ways. Still a lot of discussion about that. There's Polkinghorne. The hard problem is at the last by why would a spiritual part of humans make us self-aware? I mean, why would that happen? Well, you have to sort of think about that and try to figure out how a spiritual part would make a human being suddenly think about their own thoughts. What does neuroscience experiment? It says we have consciousness in animals. You can put spots on a porpoise's cheek, and the porpoise looks at himself in the mirror and recognizes that it's him. So do chimpanzees. They recognize a person themselves. They recognize themselves. Oh, that's pretty close to self-knowledge. When did humans get their souls? Now there's an interesting question there. Somebody already mentioned sometime back in the evolution of humans, we got good enough brain so that the interface could work and you could get a soul to interact, right? So when was that? Does anybody want to, was that 250,000 years ago? Was it 50,000 years ago? Was it 1,000,000 years ago? When did you get the brain? Well, there's an interesting thing here. Cardinal Ratzinger wrote, the first thou, however stammering, the moment when the spirit arose in the world. Evolution does not challenge faith to understand itself more profoundly, and thus to help man to understand himself and to become increasingly what he is, the being who is supposed to say thou to God of eternity. So we are challenged, we do challenge our faith to think about these kinds of questions. When did hominids get good enough to make a soul? We know that Neanderthals buried their dead. We know that they took care of their infirm and their old. We're learning more and more about Neanderthals. So did Neanderthals know good and evil? Did they go to heaven? I mean, these are not things that we're speculating about. These are things we know. So if you're going to talk about the soul and the spiritual and heaven, you have to keep these things in consideration and say, maybe the answer's nearby somewhere else. And the exciting thing is, it may cause you to stop worrying about these and find the real answer of what God did. When do humans get their soul? Well, a lot of people say, well, whenever a fertilized egg, you have your soul. Well, let's do that. Qualitatively, that sounds very nice. Let's do it quantitatively. 70%, or somewhere around there, of all fertilized eggs do not implant. Not to mention the ones that don't survive even after that. What that means is that twice as many souls never become more than a few cells. Now, if we look back over the whole human race, you're going to get a few billion. Let's say, what do we want to say, 25, 30 billion? So now you're going to say that 60 billion multicell beings have immortal souls. What would God do with all those immortal souls? That's not the question. The question is, the Creator can set it up any way the Creator wants. Why would He ever set it up so that He had that problem? It's very, very unlikely, because when we look at when humans first got their souls, they had to have a brain that was developed enough to do it. And now we find if you want to hold that a fertilized egg gets an immortal soul, you have these untold billions, tens of billions of multicelled things that have immortal souls. That doesn't make a bit of sense. And you just can't duck away from those numbers. Those numbers are really there. Now, does it mean you don't have a soul? No, it doesn't mean you don't have it. You just stop looking there. Just stop looking there. Perhaps a solution. What if the soul is nothing more than God's loving knowledge of us? Each one of us is so important to God. He has a complete knowledge of us, and He is caring for us and helping us to make our way through life and hoping for us to live with Him forever in heaven. What if that's what your soul is? It's God's loving knowledge of you. Now that allows for interactions. It allows for lots of different things to happen, but it doesn't make the soul something that needs to drive a physical body. It makes the soul something that allows us to do what God wants. Despite a large amount of evidence to the contrary, this issue must be considered open. We seem to have something extra, everybody agrees. Scripture is very ambiguous. Almost all the etymology of the Old Testament, they're not dualists at all in the Old Testament. They use the word soul, but it's used in a funny way. And in the New Testament, you don't see very much of it that you can use either. But we still need to modify our concept. Any further consideration of this must take into account what science already did. And so one of the things that the Society of Catholic Scientists and the Los Alamos Forum is committed to do is to say, let's look at science and see what parts of the table of our thinking about something science will help us with or rule out. So that's my talk. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, just a couple of things. There's so many issues you've raised, one could have 1,000 questions and comments. I just want to limit myself to a couple. In the Old Testament, first of all, if you include, what does Scripture say about the soul? If you limit yourself, if you don't look at what Catholics call the deuterocanonical books of the Old Testament, like the Book of Wisdom and so on, yes, there's very little before that about the spiritual soul. But in the Book of Wisdom, which in the later parts of the Old Testament, the Book of Wisdom, for example, you actually do find more explicit statements about the spiritual nature of the soul. And that, of course, and many other things that sort of lead into or further develop the Christian revelation. But let me finish. And in the New Testament, you left out a few key. It's true that there are very few passages in the New Testament where the idea of a spiritual soul is explicit. But as John Paul II says in one of his very important letters, or statements, the idea of a duality, not dualism, that's a very loaded term, but of it is part of Christian tradition. And he says, an essential part of Christian tradition, that there is a duality in human beings. And there are certain passages in the New Testament which he himself points to. For example, when Jesus says, do not be afraid of those who can kill the body, but be afraid of those who can kill both body and soul in Gehenna. Another example is when Paul talks about being away from the body and with the Lord in one of his letters. And so there are several passages in the New Testament, and it's easy to dismiss that and say, well, the Hebrew, a lot of people say, the Hebrew mentality was not dualistic, the whole idea of a spiritual soul sort of was an infiltration into Christian belief from Greek metaphysics, Plato and so forth. But actually, that's oversimplifying. There are ideas of a spiritual nature of humans in both the Old Testament and the New. And so I just wanted to put that on the table.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah, let me just finish and then you can answer all my points. The other thing is only peripherally related. It's also related to, it's about neuroscience and so on. And we're going to have an article coming up this fall on the website by a fellow named Aaron Scherger. and this is a little bit of a cautionary tale about over-interpreting neuroscience experiments. It was a very famous set of experiments done in the 1980s by someone named Benjamin Libet. And these experiments, I won't describe them, but many people, not Libet himself, but many people interpreted these as showing that we don't have free will. Essentially, what these experiments were supposed to show is, what they did show, is that when human subjects were made certain voluntary movements, that the brain was actually about a half a second before the person became consciously aware of having made the decision.
Millisecond.
About 500 milliseconds. About a half a second before the human subject was aware of having made the decision to move his finger or arm, the brain had something called a readiness potential building up. And some people interpreted that to mean the brain had already, below the level of consciousness, made a decision that the human being then sort of falsely interprets to be a free action. And then, and so for about 30 years, or actually that's been now about almost 50 years, that many people argued on the basis of these neuroscience experiments that free will was an illusion. But there are more recent experiments done within the last 5 or 10 years by Aaron Scherger, who I think actually works in Stanislas Dehaene's lab, or did. Scherger and his collaborators that showed that interpretation of these old experiments was probably not tenable, and that those experiments actually do not show anything about whether we have free will. But there's an example of where people interpreted neuroscience experiments as showing we have no free will, and then more careful experiments and more careful computer simulations and theoretical work showed that that was over-interpreting the data by a large degree. So we have to be very careful in jumping to philosophical conclusions about free will and other topics from sort of half-baked interpretations of neuroscience experiments. Now, you can blow me out of the water.
I agree with everything you said.
Yeah.
First of all, I think that none of this talk says there's no human soul, and that it's not a spiritual soul, and it's not important. It just says a lot of the things we've said about the soul can't be right. We have to go somewhere else and look for it. And I think that's exciting, because maybe we've been looking for these things in all the wrong places. And when we go to the right place, because science helped us, we'll go, oh, look at that, and it'll strengthen our faith immensely. Secondly, the study that you purported, this one where what they do is they have a guy tap. Just sit there and tap anytime you feel like tap, 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 tap. Every time, a few milliseconds before the guy, in the brain you can see the brain make the decision to do it. There's a precursor. Well, first of all, it doesn't rule out free will at all. It says the brain made a decision, and it has sort of a physical way of setting things up and doing it.
Interpretation is first not a few milliseconds. It's hundreds of milliseconds. And secondly, what Scherger has almost demonstrated, his collaborators, is those precursors, what's called a readiness potential, is not the brain having made the decision. That was the interpretation that everyone made.
That's not my point.
It was not, those precursors were not signs that the brain had made the decision.
That's not my point. My point is whether or not that's correct. First of all, that's a very artificial way of making a decision. You're not taking all the things into consideration, making an act of the will. You're just sort of goofing around. And I would have had to take the test, because if they asked me to take the test, I would go. Are we done? You can blow that thing right out of the water. So I agree with you. I don't think that's useful at all. But even if it is, it doesn't say that the brain doesn't do this. It just says it didn't do it the way we thought it was going to do it. There's some sort of a precursor or something. But only people who are trying to say that we don't have free will take such data and look at it. Dehaene would say, yes, we should redo that. And there have been more experiments to look at that now that say, nah, don't worry about it. But you have to look at the body of work that Dehaene does. And if once you understand exactly what he did, and an awful lot of that is in this book, but he's very clear about it, but you have to work your way along step by step. Very clever experiments. Now you can say, well, I believe this, so that has to be wrong. well, if you're going to do that, we don't have an organization anymore. We might as well all go home. If science can't make us change some of our preconceptions about God's love for us, then what are we here for? It has to do that. And what I maintain when you talk about no conflict between religion and science, it's fine. There's no conflict at all. The Catholic Church has no conflict unless you come up with something the Catholic Church doesn't like. And then it says you can't do that. Well, that's conflict as far as I'm concerned. Now, what is happening is there's a whole new brand of people, because the science now is getting more and more helpful to this, who are saying, God love you. We're not taking your soul away. We're just telling you, you have to look somewhere else for it. Yeah?
Okay, I'll try. Excuse my English.
Oh, no.
When you say to us, when the human gets their soul, it came to my mind Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, chapter 1, where God told Jeremiah, before you were in your mom's womb, I knew you were made. And it's something that really, I love it, because I always thought that God already was working in my soul even before I was born. So, is that a possibility?
Well, I don't know what the total answer is, because I think that's a very important piece of scripture. But notice it said, when you were in my womb. That means you had already attached, you were becoming something. See? But before that happened, God knew about it. Sure. God knows what he wants to do. But the fact that 60 billion souls only are made up of about 20 cells.
The soul is not made of cells. That's a philosophical error. The body is made of cells.
So, but you're telling me that that body has a soul.
Yes. Yeah. But when you say the soul is made of 3 cells.
No, I didn't say the soul.
Oh, you said you did.
If I did, I misspoke.
Okay.
The point of the matter is, a soul, which is immortal, is associated with 20 cells that don't live for a month. What do you do with 50 to 60 billion souls?
Why is that a problem? I mean, God,
why is that a problem?
No, I don't understand. If God, why is that a problem?
Why would he
for
set it
God?
up so it would
He doesn't
happen
have a
that
place
way?
to put them in heaven or something. There's like a housing shortage. I mean,
Those souls are immortal. Those souls are immortal.
Remember, God is. I think we're traditionally believe that there's a vast number of angels, for example. I mean, no numbers given, but we're told about.
So we'd be
enormous.
far luckier not to have been born.
But I mean, as I think it was who was it? Was it Niels Bohr? Or was it someone said when Einstein said God does not play dice with the universe, and another famous founder of quantum mechanics, I don't know if it was Bohr, he said, "Don't tell God what to do." And I think, though you are a physicist, you really should be a little more hesitant about telling God what he should.
I didn't tell God what to do because, you see, what I'm finding out is an awful lot of theologians are telling God what to do, just like the way around. We should neither of us do that. I'm just saying the concept of 2 to 3 times more immortal souls that never get born. The concept that has been set up by the Creator doesn't make a lot of sense.
Doesn't make sense to you.
Oh, well, they're all pink rabbits. That doesn't make sense, but they're right there. You have to
So I'm not an expert in bioethics, but I just attended a conference with Tad Picholsky, and he's the head bioethicist in the U.S. So actually, just maybe this will help you, and maybe help all of us, is that the church actually teaches we don't know when the body is ensouled. It's a mystery, and we're supposed to respect that mystery, so that's why we're not supposed to do IVF or abortion. But we don't know, so there can be a variety of opinions as long as we're respectful of the mystery.
Absolutely, I agree with that. And I'm not saying that we don't have souls. I'm just saying when you look in this corner, you find something that really doesn't make sense. Now, if
That's
God,
respecting other points of view.
Yeah, no, but the point is, if God has given us an intellect to figure out who we are and wants us to use it, and when we use it for something that's as simple as that, to just discard it, that's telling God that he just really screwed up with us.
Okay.
Okay.
Should I make one quick one? Yeah.
I think we have, what?
Michael has something.
So first of all, I'm very excited because I think this is a perfect talk to follow mine. Because it, first of all, allows me to cheat and clarify some concepts in my talk, which is always fun to do. But I'm going to suggest another direction also. I'm going to risk using and continuing the controversy or the conundrum of billions of souls to point out that I think one thing I tried to express in the way I thought about acts of will, non-physical, physical, and the boundary is to start to break apart our very dualistic and sort of mental images. So when we imagine the non-physical, the soul, we can't help it because our language, our brain has evolved to deal with the physical world. So we actually imagine individual souls, right? And we imagine them as physical objects. And we imagine them with space and time and dimension. It's very hard not to. I challenge you to picture a soul without picturing something that's physical, even though you may think it's fundamentally not physical. And what I like about what you're suggesting from my perspective, so the brain experiments are a great example. There's many people who have made statements that I find very silly of, we can trigger the part of the brain that has visions and make it feel like you had a vision. Therefore, visions are fake, and therefore, all of this religion stuff is a hoax. And I thought, well, therefore my hunger is also fake and a hoax, because I can trigger hunger in the brain, right? All you've established by those experiments, from my perspective, is the cool thing about the brain is it apparently has an interface to visions, right? Now you don't know, you've learned nothing more or less than just like the brain has an interface to tell you about hunger, it has an interface to tell you about visions. And so I totally agree. I love your analogy of taking the science to help us guide where on the table we explore. And what I tried to propose in my talk is a very, very, very useful mental model that can better interface with what neuroscience is telling us about the brain. It takes the reality of the brain as the interface incredibly seriously. It takes the reality of non-physical seriously, not in a dualistic way, but actually in an integrated, holistic way. And therefore, there's an interface also, there has to be. And it gives us a new framework and language to both look at the amazing experiments you talk about, you have to take seriously, but even just some of our own biases of, I like the comment that was made about the mystery of when the soul's really there, and respect the mystery. And it also helps a little bit, if I do decide there's a soul in every set of cells, I have to remember I'm not deciding there's a physical soul. That physical image does become a little silly. But maybe, as you said, in respecting the mystery, it's something else with the soul. So that's why I threw out my model, and I think your talk illustrates, to me, the utility of thinking in this different way that I haven't explicitly heard before, of integrating the physical and the non-physical versus keeping them very separate. So I just cheated and gave another 5 minutes to my talk, so I apologize. But I loved how your talk led to that.
I'm sorry, folks, we need to take a break here, and we'll be back at 4 o'clock.